Hello, everybody. My name is Dovilė Budrytė, and I am the president of the AABS, Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this very interesting and thought-provoking webinar. I'll start out by saying that there's definitely no shortage of critical situations challenging the survival of democracies in Ukraine and the Baltic states. The pandemic coincided with rising populism and challenges to the legitimacy of the government. And even worse was yet to come. In 2022, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia presented the entire democratic world with an unprecedented challenge of maintaining the liberal world order and supporting democratic rule. In the face of this challenge, the war has revealed the enormous ability and enthusiasm of civil society in Ukraine and the Baltic states to mobilize to resist Russia's aggression. What accounts for the successful mobilization? Is this a guarantee of the survival of democracies in Ukraine and the Baltic states? As the war continues, what are the main challenges facing these democracies? So these and other questions will be tackled by our distinctive panel. We have Hanna Shelast, who is Director of Security Studies and Global Outreach Programs at the Foreign Policy Council Ukrainian Prism and the Editor-in-Chief of UA, Ukraine Analytica. She's also a non-resident senior fellow at CEPA in Washington, D.C. Oleksiy Haran is Professor of Comparative Politics at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. He's the Research Director of Democratic Initiatives Foundation, and in 2013 to 2014, he was a member of the Council of the Maidan Movement, and in 2014 to 2016, as a political scientist, he spent several weeks at the front line near Mariupol, Luhansk, Avdiivka, and Donetsk airport. Daunis Auers is Professor of European Studies and Jean Monnet Chair at the University of Latvia, and he serves as Director at Large of the Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies. He has published widely on political parties, elections, referendums, populism, and the radical right and economic competitiveness in the Baltic states. And the webinar will be moderated by Jogilė Ulinskaitė, Associate Professor at the Institute of International Relations and Political Science at Vilnius University. Her current research integrates memory studies and emotion sociology to analyze experiences of post-communist transformations. Please note that the chat is disabled. We welcome your questions via the Q&A button. So thank you so much. And I will now ask Jogilė to take over.
Thank you, Dovilė. It's my pleasure to be here. Unfortunately, the harsh reality is that almost every day we're talking about or experiencing actually war and the growing threats to Europe, specifically to the Eastern European region. In these difficult circumstances, people have a particularly important role to play in ensuring the continuity of democracy by participating in elections, standing as candidates in elections, and being active in civic life. So it's my great pleasure to discuss with this impressive group of experts issues of great importance and complexity for the Baltic region and Ukraine. And I sincerely hope that these insights of these guests will help us better understand what we can expect in the region in this year of so many elections. So I would like to start with asking a question to Hanna. And I would like to ask you to reflect on the current situation in Ukraine, and especially in the occupied territories of Ukraine. And my question is, can we assume or can we say that resilience and non-violent civil resistance in the Russian occupied territories are consistent with democracy, with democratic process? And what do you think this resistance promotes in the country?
Thank you very much for these questions, and thank you, organizers, for this timely discussion. I will be very brief considering the agenda, how we agreed today, but we'll be open to any additional questions. And definitely, even that we are discussing today the democratic process, and here we usually think about elections, about the political parties, about these classical elements about which Oleksiy will perfectly talk later. Nevertheless, we always need to understand about the additional manifestations and the difference between the democratic society or the society that used to experience the democratic process of the participatory democracy, when people used to think that something depends on them, and how it manifests during the wartime. So if at the governmentally controlled territories, here we usually think about those elements of resilience concept as we state them in the 7 NATO baselines, where one of the first one is the ability of the state to continue providing the services, the governmental services to the population. But what is important in the resilience that it's never only about the state. And it is very difficult to speak about resilience when you're speaking about the autocratic society, because for resilience, you need the cooperation and I would say even partnership very often of the governmental and non-governmental actors with the active participation of the civil society, of the expert community, or even of those third actors, I would say, because the business elements, the volunteers groups and other, it's not only the classical thing how we perceive and how we usually think about the civil society. It is the wider scope of actors who are starting to be involved to make the state being functional and to be effective, even when you don't have the governmental strong hand, let's say, somewhere at the territories. What is becoming more interesting is at the occupied territories, because you definitely see, first of all, the clash of two systems and of two political cultures, because you see the attempts of the Russian Federation and their agents, both military and civilians, to impose the certain norms and practices at those territories. Many of them are definitely copy-pasting the Russian autocratic system, but even more with the military element that makes it even more intolerant and autocratic. But at the same time, you have people with the political culture that used to the certain elements of freedom of speech, of the right for the protest, for media rights, to being able to participate in decisions about their places. And here is definitely we see the extreme clash. And when we speak about the nonviolent resistance movement, probably we will like put it not against, but as a separate element to the general partisans movement, because a lot of partisans activities are definitely violent at those territories. But if we take the purely non-violent groups, as Yellow Ribbon, as Combat Seagulls, as the Mavka, as others, there are many of them. Some of them organized, some of them are disorganized and individual activists who are doing. For me, they are the perfect examples of the democratic culture and of the democratic process, because it is the participation of the citizens who are taking responsibility to what is happening. That is the ability of people to protest against the violation of the human rights, against the violation of the basics norms. And also it's very interesting to follow how they oppose illegal elections at those territories. So when they are helping, first of all, not to legitimize the Russian occupation and the Russian authorities over there, how they're undermining them, but at the same time explaining why it is wrong and who are responsible for this. So they are saying not that again, elections are bad, but they're explaining why Russian elections are bad, and that it is impossible for these people to conduct elections, especially under the military pressure and including military personnel. For these 2 years, we had already two waves. Like first, we had referenda, or so-called referenda, it's better to say. Then we had the local in 2022. Then we had the illegal local elections in September last year. And now we are just 1 month away from the Russian presidential elections that they are trying to organize at the occupied territories. And it's interesting to follow how the nonviolent resistance movement are reacting to these. It's not only the methods of what they're doing, but also messages that they're adding, usually explaining people how to avoid what is wrong, why that is not elections, why Russia cannot do. For me, that is quite a symbolic, because it demonstrates also the political culture of people at these territories, because they can involve, it's not that Ukrainian government is saying don't participate in this. It is locals on the ground who are promoting these ideas. And in this way, a lot of the actions, campaigns, statements that we can see in all regions, both new one and, what is interesting, the old one, I mean, those who are under the occupation since 2014, they have these similar patterns of their messages and of their activities. And the last just phrase to say that even that for many processes, the 9 years of occupation really been quite a deterioration of their ability to continue with Ukrainian identity, for their relation to the Ukrainian state, such spheres as education, especially being damaged by the Russian activities. But as soon as we are talking about elections and opposition to the Russian elections, that and about the resistance to the occupation, Crimea became one of the most active again. And it demonstrates that or over the 10 years, is better to say, we're just few days of 10 years anniversary of the Crimean annexation, demonstrated that 10 years is still not enough for the Russian Federation to bring these people totally into the Russian political discourse and Russian political culture, that you still see these basic principles that are important for people, and that seeing the liberation of Kherson region, for example, more people from Crimea started to join the nonviolent resistance movement, seeing it as the only way how they can demonstrate their readiness to participate in the future of their, at least the local community.
Thank you. Alexei, I would like to ask you now about Ukraine itself, and from what we can observe in the public sphere, or from what the experts are saying, it's rather clear that relations between the government and the opposition are not easy. And yet we still see the opportunities inherent in democracy to criticize the government, and they remain rather broad. So how would you explain that?
Yeah. Labdень, labadenье, ter. Okay, now I exhausted my knowledge of of both languages. Also, I can say at the end I will say thank you in your languages. But look, first of all, I would like to add to the question which Hannah responded. We need to understand what's going on in the occupied territories. It's not even how it was in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was totalitarian state, right? But this is a totalitarian regime in time of war. So basically, you can be killed at any moment. Even if you speak Ukrainian, this is a sign that you are not loyal. Okay, you refuse to take forcefully a Russian passport, it's also a sign of disobedience. So we need to understand how it works in the occupied territory. And by the way, this is one of the explanations why we say that it's very difficult to talk about ceasefire, which sometimes we may hear from, well, from Russia, from China, from some voices, in the West, because the ceasefire would mean that the repressions, totalitarian repressions against Ukrainians in the occupied territories will continue, and Russia is changing social demographic structure in these territories. So Ukrainians are deported, killed, tortured, Ukrainian children are deported to Russia, and so on and so forth. And I think the Baltic countries know about this element, tragic elements of history in the Soviet Union. Now, regarding democracy in Ukraine, look, we have martial law, and the country is at war, and both both government and opposition agreed to have martial law. So all of us, we understand that we are at war and we need to support a unified position and we need to support our government. And this is the explanation why the ratings of the Institute of Presidency is high. The highest is definitely the trust for the army, but there is a trust to commander-in-chief, who is president. I think this is good, despite all the problems that we have. So, and there are limits, some limits, you know, about on freedom of speech. For example, on television, we have the so-called United News, organized by several channels, and the opposition channels were not members of this United News Marathon. But having said that, I would like to stress that even under martial law, we have the possibilities to discuss, I would say freely, and to criticize the government, to criticize the landscape. That's the paradox of the situation. But if the opposition channels, despite some pressure, they are still available. They are on cable. So I watch it all the time. Many people watch it all the time. But the most important thing is that we have social media where the freedom is not limited at all, I would say. And sometimes it's bad, you know, because there are so many rumors, speculations, unrestricted criticism. But also very important for Ukrainian experts and for Ukrainian civil society are independent internet newspapers. And we have several, actually we have many very strong internet newspapers. And if you follow it every day, you have discussion. What is done wrong? What is done bad? How it should be done. For example, you know that just these days we had, I would say, quite dramatic change of the military commandment, and experts agree that this is a legitimate right of the president to change, so there's no doubt about it. But there are questions, why now? You know, what are the reasons? Maybe Zelensky was afraid of General Zaluzhny as his potential rival in the next election. So there is discussion, there are different views. Sometimes it's very, very sharp. But today I opened the internet newspaper, Ukrainska Pravda, Ukrainian Truth, for example, and there is a detailed analysis. Who was appointed? Who are these generals? You know, what is their background? What is positive? Where are the doubts? So we have this debate, and civil society is very active. It's very active with proposals, with critical suggestions. But I would like also to stress that we have also cooperation between civil society and our authorities, because we are trying to help our authorities in this very, very difficult situation. And not everything is open, actually. I mean, from our side, because we have some suggestions, we have critical remarks. Some things we are doing in a close dialogue with authorities, because we understand that this is war and not everything should be revealed, not everything should be public. So if we are talking about civil society, again, there are, you know, ways we are cooperating behind the scene, or we are suggesting some proposals, or we are sharing some information. We are doing polls, for example. We are sharing this information with authorities. It may be part of closed information, including with security forces. But we have also open debate, and this is important. So again, just compare the situation. In Russia, you cannot say that there is a war in Ukraine, right? What will happen to you? You will be imprisoned. It's not possible to say. In Ukraine, you can freely criticize our president, prime minister, whatever, you know. So definitely this is a sign of democracy.
Thank you. Daunis, maybe we should turn our attention now to the Baltic countries. So since the war has been going on for 2 years now on a full scale, this is an important factor that we should not forget when thinking about the state of democracy in the Baltic states. So what do you think will be the impact of the war on the main components of Baltic democracies, such as elections, parties, voters, civil society? What's your opinion?
Thanks for the question. Yes, I mean, we are, of course, very fortunate here in Northeastern Europe, in the 3 Baltic states, that we are not at war with Russia, that we don't have parts of our territory occupied, and that we're not experiencing the horrors that our friends in Ukraine are experiencing. We're also very fortunate that the Baltic states have more than 3 decades of democratic experience now. And the Baltic states are consolidated democracies. If we look at the Freedom House ranking, which is, of course, financed by the US government, we find that all 3 Baltic states rank above the United States of America in these rankings. And you can find similar results in other democracy rankings. So the Baltic states are fully consolidated democracies. They've been tested, as Dovile said in her introductory remarks. Over the years, we had the huge financial crisis, which hit us very badly in 2007, 2008, 2009. We had the restrictions of COVID. We've had the recent challenges coming from the Ukrainian war. But if anything, Baltic democracies have come out stronger from this. And there aren't any direct threats to Baltic democracy coming from, let's say, the Baltic states themselves. That's not to say that the war hasn't had an impact, and it has had an impact on the shape of democracy in the Baltic states. So, for example, elections in the Baltic states are peaceful, they're safe, they're secure, they're legal. But what we found is that the war in Ukraine obviously has become one of the main, if not the primary cleavage. So in a sense, there is the sort of those who are supportive of Ukraine, which is overwhelmingly the majority of political parties in the system. But there have been some parties which have been, using the classic line of "we're for peace," which basically means, we're in favor of Russia. And those parties have seen their support decline in Latvia a little bit, and new political parties, which are much more virulently actually sort of pro-Putin, not necessarily hiding behind this "we are for peace," emerge in their stead. But we've also seen that some kind of policies which are an impact of a war, such as Ukrainian refugees in the Baltic states, have become an issue. So in last year's elections in Estonia, the party which finished second, which is a radical right party, EKRE, the Estonian Conservative Party, they came out as being anti-Ukrainian refugee. They talked about welfare chauvinism, saying, well, what are we doing sharing our financial resources with these Ukrainian refugees? And one of their leaders in the political party, who's represented in parliament, said, these women coming, they're prostitutes. Why are we letting them into our country? And all kinds of outrageous things were said, which appealed to a certain type of voter. So elections have been impacted in terms of rhetoric. Political parties have been impacted. Obviously, they've had to adjust their political platforms in elections. So we see that as we're gearing up for European Parliament elections later this year, political parties have been forced to address this in their manifestos. But what's interesting is that it's also affected the political personalities. So one of the political parties in Latvia, which isn't currently in parliament, but was previously in a 4-year-long government coalition from 2018 to 2022. This political party has put as its Spitzenkandidatin, its lead candidate, a Ukrainian national. In actual fact, somebody who doesn't have Latvian citizenship, but has Ukrainian and Belgian a citizenship, which allows her to be a candidate. And she is there as a symbol of unity with Ukraine. And similarly, another party which is represented in parliament at the moment, the United List, has selected one of Latvia's most prominent NGO activists who emerged specifically as a response to the war in Ukraine, leading something called the Twitter Convoy. And the Twitter Convoy is simply an organization which takes donations of mostly pickups and 4x4s in a reasonably good state and drives them to Ukraine in a convoy and hands them over to the armed forces, comes back to Latvia, rounds up another dozen or 20 cars and takes them again. And this man, Reinis Pozņaks, he was elected European of the Year in Latvia and has now been elected to lead a party list. So in this way, we see that political parties are also very much shaped and influenced by the war. Voters, certainly too. We've seen that voters have tended to flock to the big centrist mainstream parties. And I think when it comes to the Lithuanian presidential election, also to the mainstream political candidates, including the incumbent, who seems quite well fixed, possibly to be re-elected. So those who have been consistently supportive of Ukraine in its conflict have received the backing of voters, well, in Estonia and Latvia, and then we'll see this year, but presumably also in Lithuania. And possibly the biggest impact, just to round up my initial comments, has been on civil society. Because civil society has often been seen as the sort of weakest link of the Baltic democracies. We often compare ourselves to the Nordic countries. And it's true that Baltic citizens do tend to be more passive, less involved in organizations. And the war in Ukraine changed this. We had the biggest public demonstrations coming out obviously in favor of Ukraine, marches on the Russian embassies in all three Baltic states. These were the biggest demonstrations since the late 1980s and the early 1990s and the drive to independence. People opened up their homes to Ukrainian refugees. Where I'm sitting at the moment in an apartment on the ground floor of my house was, you know, we handed over to a wonderful young family who came over from Ukraine 2 years ago after the war started. People have donated their time, their money, their goods, donating clothes, toys, all kinds of things to incoming Ukrainians. And it's really has shown Latvia at its strongest. And the government has also sort of continued this thing. There are some laws which many people approve of. So, for example, drink drivers these days, if they are over a certain amount of promils, their cars are confiscated and handed over to Ukraine as one driver of a very newly purchased and expensive Porsche discovered not long after this war was instigated. And I'm sure there are some Ukrainian soldiers on the front, hopefully enjoying the comforts of a brand new Porsche 4x4 confiscated from this drink driver. So, yeah, that's all from me, Jogile.
Yes, I see Alexei wants to comment.
Yes, because you mentioned about support from the Baltic states to Ukraine, and I would like to use this possibility to thank you all for what you are doing. And we know about this support which is coming in many fields, and we know that if we look at the percentage of the budget, of your budget, so actually this percentage is much higher than the percentage of the support to Ukraine which is coming from other big powers and great countries. So we appreciate it so much. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alexei. Hannah, I would like to proceed with the questions and maybe coming back to considering the significance of resilience in democracies. So since Ukraine is kind of guided by the NATO framework in which the stability of the political process is one of the foundations, so what would you say has the concept of resilience sort of emphasized for the democratic process in the country in terms of NATO membership.
Thank you very much. You know, definitely Ukraine is probably one of the pioneer states who tried to implement and to test what is even more the resilience concept, while for quite a number of years, the NATO member states been discussing the concept. The first NATO documents appeared around 2016, all these commitments, nice on the paper, but nobody really tried because luckily no crisis. The first crisis that allowed to try only one point from the resilience was definitely a COVID pandemic and everything connected with the stability of the health system and how NATO could contribute to the logistics and to the delivery processes during the COVID. But that was a very small first crash test that didn't allow the total understanding of the process. Ukraine in 2021 adopted the national resilience concept that, on the one hand, had all the 7 points from NATO, plus 2 additional that incorporated also information security and financial security that are also quite an important in terms of crisis. And since 2022, needed to check how it works in reality. What we experience now, that I know that at least several countries been coming, like Lithuania, for example, studying very much the Ukrainian experience. The Swedish Psychological Agency just sent their team to Ukraine to look what does mean it in practice, not in theory, what does mean resilience. And that is really interesting at what we have the emphasis. So if there are topics like protection of critical infrastructure or cybersecurity or let's say the access to food and water or the possibility to have access to communication systems like mobiles and all this stuff, that's easier. That's technical things. Even when we speak about medicine and health system, it is more or less the technical issues. Do you have a protocols? Do you know how to work? Do you have a storage for what is necessary? However, what became really interested for us, it is the spheres of political stability and the sphere of information security, because these two issues are demonstrated usually in times of war or any crisis, we had the two classical issues contradicting with each other. That is the territorial integrity of the state and the right of the people for self-identification. There were two concepts that for almost a century been the prime dilemma probably for the international relations. And during the war, we faced another issue. It is the martial law and the limitations, restrictions that people already voluntarily took because of the war, understanding that it should be closing of some registries, for example, not total access to information because your enemy also will have this access. It is sometimes more robust information policy from the state. It is the sometimes census. So people understand on one hand that the certain rights or certain freedoms can be limited. But at the same time, we are raising the question that, okay, but for how long we can live in these limitations, or where are limitations to these restrictions? And probably here we faced this issue in Ukraine very practically, because yes, we still could receive as citizens most of the governmental services. Even in the most targeted and damaged cities, because we had digital governance, a lot of services being digitalized. So we faced that we had this interaction. We had some voting for the simple questions also digitally. The petitions at the website of the president is still working. So on the one hand, you saw this continuation, and then elections came, or better to say the decisions about the regular elections came, and it is a dilemma. Is it the continuation of the state and ability for people to have it, or during the war you cannot have it? And can the state still be resilient if they're not able to organize elections, or security is more important? So definitely this dilemma that is currently on the agenda and that will be coming again and again as long as war is continuing, because more of these questions are coming. It's not only presidential elections, it is the mayor elections, it is the local elections, it is the parliamentary elections. It is all those things that we used too. Information security, on the one way, resilience concept is saying you need to be prepared for any type of the enemy propaganda, for the disinformation operations, for all these trolls, bots, wherever included there. But then it is the question that Alexei described about the single marathon and the ability or not ability of the certain channels to be present. Was it okay for the first 2 months? Is it okay for the 2 years of the war? Will it be okay for the next year of the war? So it seems to me that we are now still in this testing phase. We de facto became the pilot project for the resilience concept, where we try to understand both the balance between the issues in terms of the democratic process, but also about what is really should be included there. What are the restrictions and limitations, self-imposed or governmental imposed on us? But here is always an additional question, how to avoid manipulations with both of them. And that is the question that probably only the democratic society are able to respond, because that is the discourse and dialogue within the society that should exist about these issues. None of them can be just imposed. And if we would speak about the states without the developed democracy, for them it would be the open door, not even the window, for the possibility to jeopardize the democratic rights, to bring more and more of the autocratic instruments or practices, let's say, to the society. So it seems to me that especially the last 6 months, Ukraine is definitely on the edge of some of these balancing acts, trying to understand these limits. And only after the certain period of time and a lot of the research, we will be able to answer the questions. What are the lessons learned? What was effective? What was not? What are the risks that other countries should really consider when we speak about the political process? Because originally, when this political stability was written in the resilience concept, de facto, it was meant very simple things. Okay, the leader of the state is killed. Do you have a protocol? Who is the next one? Is it clearly written in your state? Yep. Designated survivor in the United States, or the head of the parliament who is taking the role of the president, or the building of your parliament exploded. Does your parliament have a right to vote sitting somewhere in the park? I mean, I'm definitely joking about the park, but something, yeah, so, because sometimes your regulations, your procedures can be written that you should be in the room for voting or something. Do you have protocol? But the war demonstrated that these things are not enough. And de facto, during the war, if we speak about the resilient society and ability of the society to overcome the crisis, we also need to think about such stuff as elections, as participatory democracy, as the right for the protest, and many, many others that are the evidence of the healthy democracy.
Thank you, Hannah. Alexei, could you reflect some more on how you imagine that the future elections in Ukraine could look like?
Well, there are questions because I believe in March, April, the presidential term is coming to the end, and we understand that there would be a lot of speculations from the Russian side about legitimacy of the president, but also the questions from international community. So here I would say that there are several reasons which prevent conducting elections in the present day situation. First, according to the constitution, parliamentary elections are strictly prohibited under martial law. Also, under martial law, it's not possible to change the constitution. So basically, unless we have martial law, parliamentary elections are not possible. The more difficult question is about presidential and local elections because directly they are not mentioned in the constitution. So basically, it's more about the spirit of the constitution, you know, should they be conducted under martial law or not? So let's come to other points. Security reasons. You know, if the whole country is bombarded, how can you organize election? How can you organize electoral campaign? Okay, security issue. But I think the most important question is about what kind of elections do you want to have? Is it just, you know, to tick the box? Or we need competitive and substantive, you know, discussion during these elections. I think we would agree that, you know, to have elections is not just, you know, ticking the box. We need to have debate. Now, question, can we have open debate under martial law? And not, I mean, not just martial law, but real war with all the signals of alarms in Kiev. And well, and Kiev is, I would say, is a little bit in better situation because we have a lot of air defense here. But in the territories which are all the time shelled. Now, if we think about elections, it would mean that opposition would be very harsh to the government, and the government would criticize opposition, right? This is the nature. This is the nature of elections. We need to have this open debate. Can we allow this open debate in time of war when Russia is trying to conduct informational operation? Whom this debate will benefit? First of all, these discussions, sharp discussions between mistakes done during the war, on the eve of the war, changes in military commandment, and so on and so forth. So I think basically we are not able to have this kind of really open and competitive debate. We can make it formal, but do we need it? So that's why first of all, 80% of Ukrainians, they said that it's not time for elections. No. And most Ukrainian civil society organizations also agreed that no, it's not time for elections right now. Finally, you know, there was a kind of memorandum which came from political parties in Ukrainian parliament, including opposition, and they agreed that we need to postpone elections. We don't know. We don't know how it will all develop. So if it's kind of, you know, low intensity conflict, that's one thing, because between 2014 and 2022, we have 6 different elections, different type of elections, 2 presidential, 2 parliamentary, 2 local elections. But this was low intensity conflict, right? Now it's different. So basically, I would say that actually it's the presidential side which is interested to conduct elections sooner, rather sooner than later. Why? Because, you know, we don't know how the situation would develop, and the ratings of president, you know, they are high, but they may go down. But nevertheless, you know, opposition also is saying, no, it's not the right time to have elections. So I would say there is a general consensus in Ukraine. Now, the question is, what should we do if the war continues? There is a suggestion from opposition actually is, okay, we don't have elections, but let's have a government of national unity, or let's have technocratic government, you know, in order to legitimize, to give more legitimacy to the government. I don't know whether it will happen or not, but what is clear for me is that in present situation, it's not possible to conduct elections. And it doesn't mean that Ukrainians are not democratic, vice versa. Actually, we did a poll during the war. 64% of Ukrainians consider democracy as the best model. 14% said that in some cases, authoritarianism may be better than democracy. This is in time of war. So 64 against 14%. I think this is a very good result even for Western community. I would not like to idealize the situation with democracy in Ukraine. Actually, just recently we saw some operations by security services against some watchdog media. There was some pressure on businessmen, but what is important that there were protests in the society. Society wasn't silent. It was everywhere in the news. That's important. And actually, at a certain point, the government had to retreat, and the head of security services, he actually provided his excuses, and the person who was responsible for this operation against one of the media, he was fired. But there would be additional investigation. So this is important to see, that there would be continuations. The government is to react to the criticism which is done in this present situation under martial law.
Thank you. Coming back to Baltics, and I have another question from Daunis, and I'm already looking into Q&A box, so I will have sort of double question. So could you address issues of de-Russification policies in the Baltics since the war started? So how democratic are those kind of policies? How do they impact Baltic societies? And there was a question in the Q&A box. Has the attitude towards Russian policy changed in such specific regions as Latgale? What do you think? What are the current prospects of Elksnis or Bortasevičius to create their own political party, which will take the pro-Russian place of the Saskina party? Long question.
Okay. Thank you, Yogit. I'll take the first part of the question first. Yes, this is a question which has been asked about the sort of democratic nature of what we might call de-Russification policies, which have been undertaken in all three Baltic states, but especially in Estonia and Latvia, which have large Russian-speaking minorities. In Lithuania, Russian speakers are only about 5% of the population, so less pertinent there. Now, these policies are essentially policies which political parties and society supported in the early 1990s, when after independence was renewed, the idea was to go back to the sort of states that we'd had in the 1920s, 1930s, which were quite national states. But really, it proved to be impossible to do this because the Soviet era had led to a large-scale demographic change in Estonia and Latvia, where primarily Russian-speaking citizens, Soviet citizens, had migrated to mostly the cities in Estonia and Lithuania. And so in 1989, for instance, when the last Soviet census was carried out, ethnic Latvians made up 52% of the population of the country and others 48%. Now, it wasn't possible to carry out these, let's say, de-Russification policies in the 1990s because international society essentially wouldn't allow it. And international society, by which I mean the OSCE, NATO, and the European Union, had a great deal of leverage over the Baltic states in the 1990s because all three Baltic states saw their central policies as joining the European Union, joining the West, and joining NATO as security guarantees. And so the hoped-for policies to create a single schooling system, to push Russian out of the public sphere as much as possible, and so on, this simply didn't take place. But now, over the last 2 years, we've seen in a very accelerated way these sort of policies introduced. And I'll just quickly sort of say what they are. So the first set of policies are the school system. In Estonia and Lithuania, parallel school systems, Estonian-speaking and Russian-speaking, Latvian and Russian-speaking, have existed until the current day. They are now being phased out In Latvia, very quickly, within 2 years, the Russian school system will have been eradicated and all schools will be Latvian speaking. And in Estonia, it goes on until the early 2030s. So it's a much more progressive system. But for me, I mean, I think this is actually about creating opportunities, because we know that the Russian-speaking schools have offered a poorer level of education, which we can see through centralized examinations, and that Russian-speaking pupils don't have the language skills to compete with Latvian students, to get into university, public universities, to get into the civil service, and sometimes even in the private sector. So really, this will be a leveling out of opportunities, as I understand it. There are also changes in language, in that many public services now are no longer being offered in the Russian language. These are not essential services like health, which continue to be offered in both. But for example, if you want to take a driving test in Latvia now, you can only do it in Latvian. You can't do it in Russian. And the web pages of certain public institutions, like the president's offices, have also sort of gotten rid of their Russian language websites. So this is a much more soft approach, although there are some professions which are being regulated increasingly now. So for instance, taxi drivers in Estonia need to have a certain level of Estonian language knowledge now in order to work. Probably the most visible change has been in terms of culture and monuments on the streets. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of Soviet-era monuments celebrating Soviet victory in the Second World War, which to the Baltic states, of course, was the beginning of their occupation and no sort of victory. These have been removed, in some cases renamed. So in Tartu, Estonia, there was a bridge built in 1965 known as the Victory Bridge. And that's been renamed now to the Peace Bridge. The streets where Russian embassies are based have been renamed, mostly to some variation of Independent Ukraine Street or Ukrainian Hero Street, just to annoy them. And it does annoy them, so it's worked very well. Symbols such as the ribbon of St. George, as well as obviously the V, the Z, these have been banned. More controversial are things like, getting rid of the Pushkin monuments in Riga and other sort of cultural monuments. But again, this is seen as part of this de-Russification program. And it's even touched on residency. Russian citizens living in Latvia now have to pass a Latvian language exam if they want to stay in Latvia. These are the ones under 75. Those over 75 don't have to take this language exam. And only a minority of the 20,000 odd people who fall into this category have managed to pass the exam so far. And so there will be an issue coming up soon of what to do with those who haven't passed the exam. And with that, Jogile, I will finish my remarks.
Thank you. I will continue with Q&A and have a question for Hannah. There's a question asking, is the difference between Russian and Ukrainian political culture in Donetsk and Luhansk visible also among Ukrainian supporters of Russia in those oblasts? Or is the cultural division actually a political division between supporters and opponents of the Russian occupation?
Good question, and it is not that simple. It's definitely incorporate both answers that you already described in your question. But why I say that the situation on the ground is much more difficult. The biggest parts of Donetsk and Lugansk regions being occupied since 2014. However, not totally, not the whole territory of Donetsk and Lugansk territories have been occupied and still not occupied, even that some additional territories of these regions being occupied since 2022. So de facto, you have like 3 levels or 3 circles of the territories over there. Definitely those territories that have been occupied since 2014, they've been under the extreme Russian information pressure, political pressure. It is the significant change in demography because a lot of the people being brought from Russia to this territory. And you see it in all the processes inside of the territories, how much they are within the Russian political culture, not because they've been before. No, it's just because 10 years you're living in these conditions, your administration is acting as part of Russia. And even that fact that Russia incorporated the Donetsk and Lugansk regions only last year within these so-called referendum and everything, unification as they named it. But de facto, the whole governmental processes, local authorities, everything being the previous years also under the Russian process. The different situation with the places like Mariupol, that's been not occupied since 2014, and they've been occupied only in 2022. Here is definitely you have a significant clash in the political cultures of the people, but at the same time, why I said that the situation is even more complicated, the question is what you can express from what you used to, because as Alexei described, any kind of demonstration that you have any affiliation with Ukraine is what is not just unwelcome, but extremely dangerous. Just being wearing something blue and yellow, not speaking about having the flag, it is already the possibility for you to be arrested on the street. Recently, we had news from Berdyansk that if previously there were plenty of examples of Russian forces burning books from the libraries, taking off books, Ukrainian books from schools, and either getting them away or even burning. I mean, there's pictures like from the 1930s in the Russian media, how proud they are of burning Ukrainian poets, for example. But last month, we received information from the activists from Berdyansk that Russian soldiers started to come to houses of people and checking if you have Ukrainian books, taking off these books from you, so you would not have it at home. The same is happening with plenty of other manifestations of your identity. And as you can imagine, it's not only about political or visual, that's also if you oppose anything connected with the Russian political culture. As soon as you say anything against V or Z, against the Russian president or against the Russian authorities, you are under the same threat. And just an arrest and some fine will be the best variant that you can get. But usually it is probably 1-2% from those who are arrested receive such a soft punishment. But at the same time, we are absolutely aware that it is also a certain amount of so-called collaborants at those territories. Without them, it would be impossible to occupy some of the places. And these people predominantly are those who are with the extreme Soviet nostalgia, or with the pro-Russian views, exactly praying the style of the Russian president with his authoritarian. When you look to the background of these people, it's very diverse. Some of them are the ex-members of the Communist Party, even during the independence time. So those with the views here, you understand the logic and the pattern. Some of these people are those who've been members of the Party of Regions and with the President Yanukovych and his team. So those people who felt unsatisfied with the democratic changes after Maidan. A lot of these people who became collaborants are of those who've been accused in corruption previously, with serious criminal cases against them and with different schemes, who are just making money from these and decided that that is an excuse for them. There are other groups. I mean, we can continue if we would like to make a portrait, but meaning that for each of these people, it can be different motive. So some of them are supporting Russia, but some of them just found this situation as the possibility for the certain political career, which is easier for them to do in the war times under authoritarian regime, when the locals should not elect you, but you are just appointed, rather than the democratic process of the independent Ukraine in which they needed to live before.
Thank you. We are running out of time. Alexei, do you want to elaborate, or is it a brief comment?
Yeah, Very brief, because I think it's important to understand the dynamics, what was going on in Donbass and Lugansk. And basically, I agree with Hannah. But you know, the last credible poll which was made in Lugansk and Donetsk was in April 2014, and it showed that 70% of the population of the region doesn't want to secede from Ukraine. 30% were in favor, which is quite high, but 70% were against. And actually, the so-called separatists, they were on the verge of collapse in August 2014. And that's why Russia sends regular troops. But even with Russian regular troops, until 2022, only 1/3 of Donbass was under Russian control. 1/3. 2/3 remained under Ukrainian control, and basically the trends there in non-occupied Donbass, they were in line with the general trends in Ukraine towards more patriotism, more, you know, all regional identity, national identity. So basically, this is the explanation, one of the explanations why Putin started this invasion, because, you know, he couldn't influence the situation in the whole Ukraine, including in non-occupied Donbass, which was majority. In the occupied areas, definitely there were different kinds of segments of population, clearly pro-Russian, and Hannah mentioned about that, including criminals, you know, which enjoyed the new situation, you know, to steal and to govern. There were still a large segment of pro-Ukrainian population, and there was a swamp. We do not want the war, stop firing, you know, we just need peace, and that's all, in the occupied parts of Donetsk and Donbass. So the situation wasn't, you know, now definitely it's deteriorated because of the war and because of the more Russian troops, and many of these peoples actually are mobilized as a cannon fodder. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, all the participants, all the panelists. Thank you for interesting questions. And I think the whole fruitful discussion shows us how many different facets of democracy and democratic process we can see even under conditions of the war. Thank you. See you next time.